James had never intended to stop. The streets of the old district, bathed in the sickly yellow light of flickering lampposts, held no appeal to him. The buildings were relics of a bygone era, their facades crumbling under the weight of time. But something about that night, a night thick with mist and the whispers of an impending storm, led his feet astray. He had been wandering for hours, the city's familiar streets giving way to those he had never seen before. And then, like a ghost materializing from the fog, he saw it. A bar nestled between two dilapidated buildings. Its neon sign, once vibrant, now sputtered in and out of life, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked pavement. The name was barely legible, the letters faded and peeling, but James could just make out the words, "The Phantom Bar." A sense of unease settled in his gut, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled him forward. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door, it creaked like the hinges of a coffin, announcing his arrival to whoever or whatever lay within. The interior was dimly lit, the only sources of light being the flickering neon sign outside and a handful of dusty, low-hanging bulbs that barely pierced the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that James couldn't quite place. The bar was sparsely populated, the few patrons hunched over their drinks, faces obscured by shadow. They didn't look up as he entered, their attention fixed on their glasses as though they were staring into the depths of the abyss. James hesitated at the threshold, a primal instinct urging him to turn and leave, to return to the safety of the streets outside. But the door closed behind him with a soft click, as if of its own accord, and he found himself rooted to the spot. A figure moved behind the bar, emerging from the shadows. The bartender was an older man, his face lined with deep wrinkles that told tales of a hard life. His eyes, however, were what drew James's attention. They were hollow, empty of any spark of life, as if the soul had long since departed, leaving behind nothing but a shell. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked, his voice a low rasp, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. James swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Whiskey," he managed to say, his voice sounding small in the oppressive quiet of the bar. The bartender nodded, turning to retrieve a bottle from the shelf behind him. As he poured the amber liquid into a chipped glass, James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the patrons remained eerily still, their faces hidden in the shadows. "First time here?" the bartender asked, sliding the glass across the counter. James nodded, wrapping his fingers around the cold glass. "Yeah, just found the place." The bartender's lips twisted into something resembling a smile, but it was devoid of warmth. "The bar has a way of finding people when they need it most." James frowned, lifting the glass to his lips. The whiskey was surprisingly smooth, its warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at the bartender, his unease growing. "What's this place called?" "The Phantom Bar," the bartender replied, his voice tinged with something James couldn't quite place. Pride, perhaps, or maybe something darker. James set the glass down, his eyes scanning the room. The bar's name tugged at a memory, something he'd heard long ago but couldn't quite recall. "This place has been here a while, hasn't it?" The bartender nodded slowly. "Longer than you might think." A chill ran down James's spine, as the bartender's words hung in the air. The bar's silence felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for something. James shook his head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread. He took another sip of his drink, hoping the alcohol would calm his nerves. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Movement in the mirrors lining the back wall behind the bar. He turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just his reflection and that of the bartender, both distorted slightly by the old, warped glass. Yet as he stared, he could have sworn he saw something flicker in the background, a shadow, or maybe just a trick of the light. James blinked, and it was gone. But the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Anything else you need to know?" the bartender asked, his tone casual, as if they were discussing the weather. James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. What's the story behind this place?" The bartender's gaze grew distant, as though he were looking back through the fog of years long past. "A brawl," he said after a moment. "A brawl that got out of hand. Men died here. Over what? No one remembers. But they say their spirits never left." A cold shiver ran down James's spine. "Ghosts." The bartender shrugged, but there was a grim set to his mouth. "Call them what you will, but their anger, that lingers, and it's said that on certain nights they return, reliving that final bloody night. Those unlucky enough to be here when it happens, well, let's just say they don't leave." James felt the blood drain from his face. He wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss it as an old man's tale meant to scare tourists, but the weight of the bartender's words felt too real, too heavy. Before he could respond, the door behind him creaked open again, and a rush of cold air swept into the bar. James turned, expecting to see another patron entering, but the doorway was empty. The door itself slowly closed, the click of the latch echoing through the silence. He turned back to the bartender, who was now staring intently at something behind James, his expression unreadable. "Drink up," the bartender said softly. "You'll want to finish that before midnight." James tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest, but the bartender's cryptic words echoed in his mind, refusing to be ignored. The idea of spirits trapped in this dilapidated bar seemed absurd, yet something about the place felt wrong, as though it was out of sync with reality. The whiskey no longer warmed him. Instead, it chilled him to the bone. He took a deep breath and glanced around the bar, trying to focus on anything other than the creeping dread that threatened to overwhelm him. The patrons were still there, still hunched over their drinks, their faces hidden by the shadows. But now, in the dim light, James could see that there was something off about them. Their clothes were outdated, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were moving through molasses. They seemed more like specters than people, their presence adding to the bar's eerie atmosphere. James turned back to the bar, trying to distract himself. He looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar and was startled by how pale and drawn he appeared, his eyes wide and anxious. The mirror, though dusty and tarnished, offered a clear enough view of the room behind him, and as he stared, he noticed something strange. The patrons' reflections were there, but they didn't match their real-world counterparts. In the mirror, the figures seemed more substantial, their faces clearer, but twisted with expressions of anger and pain. Their mouths moved silently, as though they were screaming, but no sound emerged. A cold sweat broke out on James's forehead as he realized that in the mirror, The patrons' gazes were fixed on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked away from the mirror, his eyes darting to the room around him. The patrons remained where they were, seemingly oblivious to him, but the image in the mirror was seared into his mind. He grabbed his glass, intending to take a long swig to steady his nerves, but his hand froze halfway to his mouth. The whiskey in the glass was swirling, slowly at first, but then with increasing speed, as though stirred by an invisible hand. The liquid darkened, taking on a deep, almost blood-red hue. James stared at it in horror as faint images began to form in the swirling depths, faces contorted in rage and terror, hands reaching out as if to grab him. He dropped the glass in shock, the whiskey splashing across the bar and dripping to the floor. The glass rolled to a stop, but the images lingered in his mind, a vivid reminder of the unnatural forces at play in this cursed place. "Something wrong with your drink?" the bartender asked, his voice unnervingly calm. James's throat was dry, and he struggled to find his voice. I saw something in the glass," he stammered, feeling ridiculous even as he spoke the words. "Faces. And it changed color." The bartender didn't react with surprise or disbelief. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. "The spirits here aren't always content to stay out of sight," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "They've been known to make themselves known in the strangest ways. Some say they try to communicate through the drinks, through the mirrors, or maybe they're just trying to remind us they're still here." James stared at the bartender, a sense of growing dread tightening around his chest. "Why?" he whispered. "Why are they still here?" The bartender leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto James's with an intensity that made him want to recoil. "Because they died with unfinished business. Rage, fear, and regret keep them bound to this place. The brawl that killed them wasn't just a fight, it was a slaughter. The violence was so intense, so sudden, that their souls were ripped from their bodies, trapped here, unable to move on." James felt a chill spread through his body, the bartender's words sinking into his mind like claws. He could almost picture it, the chaos of the brawl, the screams, the blood pooling on the floor, the final gasps of those who died, their spirits torn from the physical world and locked in this purgatory. "They're angry," the bartender continued, his voice low. "Angry at how they died. Angry that they're still here. And sometimes that anger manifests in ways we can see, hear, even touch." James shivered, glancing at the other patrons again. Had they noticed? Did they know what was happening around them, or were they too far gone into their drinks to care? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it didn't matter. If the spirits were real, and if they were as angry as the bartender said, then James was in grave danger. "I need to leave," James muttered, standing abruptly. But the moment he did, the room seemed to shift around him. The walls closed in, the dim lights flickered, and the air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. He stumbled, catching himself on the bar, his vision swimming. The bartender's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "You can't leave, not yet," he said, his voice urgent. "The spirits aren't done with you. They've seen you now, and they won't let you go so easily." James tried to pull away, panic rising in his chest. "Let go of me," he demanded, his voice trembling. The bartender released him, but his expression remained grave. "You can't run from them, James. Not until they're finished with you." James backed away, his heart pounding in his ears. He turned to the door, desperate to escape, but as he did, the mirror caught his eye again. This time the reflections were more than just twisted faces. They were moving, coming closer, their eyes burning with a malevolent light. The room behind him remained still, but in the mirror, the spirits were converging on him, their hands outstretched, their mouths open in silent screams. James's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. The spirits were inside the bar, but their true forms, their true rage, was reflected in the glass. They were trapped in the mirror, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. And now, they had seen him. They knew he was there, and they wanted him to join them. He turned back to the bartender, desperate for answers. "What do they want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The bartender's eyes were dark, unreadable. "They want what they lost. They want you to feel what they felt. They want company." James felt the walls closing in again, the spirit's reflections growing clearer, more defined. He could almost hear their cries now, a low, mournful wail that sent shivers down his spine. He was trapped, caught between the living and the dead, in a place where the past refused to rest. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, James realized that the spirits wouldn't stop until they had dragged him into their world, until he became one of them. James's breathing grew shallow as the weight of the bartender's words settled on him like a heavy shroud. The air around him seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides as the oppressive silence of the bar deepened. He tried to push down the rising panic, to think of a way out, but his mind kept circling back to the same terrifying conclusion. He was trapped. The patrons remained hunched over their drinks, unmoving, as though they hadn't heard a word of the bartender's grim tale. But James knew better now. He could feel the presence of the spirits, sense their anger simmering just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. And then, as if on cue, the clock above the bar struck midnight. The chime was deep and resonant, cutting through the thick air like a knife. The sound reverberated through the room, sending a jolt of fear through James's body. He turned towards the source of the noise, but the clock was obscured by shadow, its face barely visible in the dim light. As the final chime faded, the bar seemed to hold its breath. The patrons froze, their hands pausing mid-motion, as if time itself had stalled. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder outside. But then, slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The air grew colder, and the lights dimmed further until they were little more than pinpricks of light in the gloom. The walls, once worn but solid, seemed to tremble, and the floor beneath James's feet creaked ominously. He glanced around, heart pounding, as a low guttural sound began to rise from the shadows, a sound that sent chills down his spine. It was the sound of rage, of voices raised in anger, the echoes of a conflict long past. The noise grew louder, more distinct, until James could make out the words, accusations, threats, desperate pleas. The ghosts of the bar were reenacting the final moments of their lives, their fury and despair filling the room like a storm. James backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, and the voices grew more frenzied, overlapping in a cacophony of rage. Glasses shattered on the bar, as though hurled by invisible hands, and the tables shook violently, their legs scraping against the floor. And then, the brawl began. It was as if a switch had been flipped, unleashing a maelstrom of violence. Chairs were upended, and bottles flew off the shelves, crashing to the ground in a shower of glass. The patrons, the spirits, finally moved, their forms twisting and distorting as they lashed out at one another with ghostly fists. The air was thick with the sound of impact, of blows landing with sickening force, of bodies hitting the floor with bone-crunching finality. But the worst part was the realization that these weren't just echoes of the past. James could feel the impact of each punch, the force of each blow reverberating through the room. The ghosts weren't just reliving their deaths. They were making the violence real again, bringing it into the present, into his world. A chair sailed through the air, narrowly missing James's head. He ducked instinctively, his heart racing, and looked around wildly for an escape. But the bar was a whirlwind of chaos, the spirits' forms blending with the shadows, their faces contorted with fury. Their rage was palpable, a living thing that filled the room, suffocating him. James stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose floorboard, and he fell hard onto his back. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment he lay there, gasping for breath. Above him the brawl raged on, the spirits paying no mind to the living intruder in their midst. But as he struggled to his feet, a sudden clarity pierced through the fog of panic. These spirits, these tortured souls, were not bound by the rules of the living. They existed in a realm of their own, one where time and space twisted and bent to their will. The bar itself had become a battlefield, a place where the violence of the past refused to die. James knew he had to get out, but the door was blocked by the melee, and the walls seemed to press in closer with every passing second. The spirits were everywhere now, their faces twisted with anger, their voices rising in a terrifying crescendo. It was as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him, the boundaries between the living and the dead disintegrating. He pushed through the chaos, dodging flying debris and ghostly fists, his eyes locked on the door. But each step forward felt like a struggle against an unseen force, as if the bar itself was trying to hold him back. The door seemed further away with each passing second, and the cold realization that he might never escape clawed at the edges of his mind. And then he saw it, a figure at the center of the storm, standing where the bartender had been moments before. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of rage. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, his hands clenched into fists. This was no ordinary spirit. This was the source of the violence, the leader of the doomed brawl. James's eyes locked onto the man's, and in that moment, he felt a wave of anger wash over him, anger that wasn't his own. It was as if the spirit's rage had seeped into him, filling him with a burning desire for revenge. He could feel the spirit's memories, flashes of the brawl, of betrayal, of blood, pounding in his skull like a drumbeat. The spirit moved towards him, slow and deliberate, his eyes burning with a fury that was centuries old. James could feel the heat of it, the raw, unbridled rage that had been simmering for so long, finally released. And as the spirit advanced, James realized that he was the target, the focus of this spirit's undying wrath. "No," James gasped, backing away, but his legs felt like lead, refusing to carry him further. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, a force of nature that threatened to crush him under its weight. The other spirits, caught up in their own violent reenactments, seemed to fall back as the leader approached, their attention shifting to James. Their faces, twisted in anger and pain, reflected the spirit's own fury. And James realized with a jolt of terror that they all wanted the same thing. They wanted him to feel their pain, to experience their rage, to join them in their endless, violent purgatory. The leader raised a hand, and James braced himself for the blow that would surely follow, his heart pounding in his chest. But then, something inside him snapped. A surge of defiance, a refusal to be consumed by the spirit's rage. He couldn't give in, couldn't let himself be pulled into their nightmare. He reached out, grabbing the nearest object, a jagged piece of broken glass from one of the shattered bottles, and held it in front of him, the sharp edge glinting in the dim light. The spirit hesitated, its eyes flicking to the glass, and for the first time, James saw something other than rage in its expression. Confusion, maybe even fear, but it was too late. The spirit's momentum carried it forward, and James, driven by a mix of fear and determination, lashed out with the glass, slashing through the air. The glass passed through the spirit's form, meeting no resistance, but the effect was immediate. The spirit let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound that echoed through the bar like a shockwave. The other spirits recoiled, their forms flickering, and the storm of violence around James seemed to pause. The leader staggered back, its form wavering, the rage in its eyes replaced by something else. Anguish, perhaps, or the realization that it was still trapped, still unable to escape its fate. James didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, the chaos around him dissolving into a blur as he sprinted towards the door. The spirits reached out, their hands grasping at the air, but they were too slow, too far gone in their own torment to stop him. He burst through the door, the cool night air hitting him like a slap to the face. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the sounds of the bar, the echoes of violence fading into silence. James stumbled down the street, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bar, that hellish place, receded into the distance, swallowed by the night. But even as he fled, he knew the truth. The spirit's anger had only been momentarily abated. The bar still held their rage, their pain, and it would continue to haunt the living, drawing in those unlucky enough to stumble upon it. And one day the spirits would find another to take their place. The night air was crisp, but it did little to cool the feverish panic that gripped James as he stumbled through the deserted streets. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each one a reminder of the horror he had just escaped. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the spirits pouring out of the bar in pursuit, but the street behind him was empty. The phantom bar, with its dim neon sign and ghostly patrons, had vanished into the mist, as though it had never been there at all. But James knew better. The bar was real, and so were the spirits trapped within its walls. Their rage and pain had reached out to him, dragging him into their nightmare. And even though he had escaped, he could still feel their presence lingering in the back of his mind, a dark shadow that refused to be shaken. He didn't stop running until he reached the relative safety of his apartment, slamming the door behind him and throwing the deadbolt into place. Only then did he allow himself to collapse onto the couch, his chest heaving with exertion. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, he simply sat there, trying to catch his breath, to process everything that had happened. But the images of the spirits, their twisted faces, their desperate fury, played over and over in his mind like a broken film reel. He needed answers needed to understand what he had encountered, and, more importantly, how to avoid it ever happening again. He grabbed his laptop from the coffee table and opened it, his hands trembling as he typed in a search for the bar. The Phantom Bar, he typed, and then, almost as an afterthought, added haunted. The search results populated slowly, the spinning wheel of the browser seeming to mock his impatience. When the page finally loaded, he began to scroll, his eyes scanning the links with growing frustration. Most of the results were irrelevant: old ghost stories, urban legends, and a few amateur ghost hunting sites that offered little in the way of useful information. But then, one link caught his eye. The Phantom Bar Massacre, a forgotten tragedy. The title sent a shiver down his spine. He clicked on the link, and the page loaded a faded newspaper article, yellowed with age and scanned into digital form. The article was from a local paper, dated nearly a century ago, and it detailed the tragic events that had taken place in the Phantom Bar. As James read, the full horror of the story unfolded before him. The bar had once been a popular spot for locals, a place where workers from the nearby factories would gather to drink away their troubles. But one night, what had started as a simple argument between two men had escalated into an all-out brawl, fueled by alcohol and old grudges. The article described the chaos in graphic detail. Bottles were smashed, tables overturned, and fists flew with deadly intent. The fight had spiraled out of control so quickly that by the time the authorities arrived, it was too late. Several men were dead, their bodies lying in pools of blood, while others were left broken and battered. But the most chilling detail was the way the article described the aftermath, the sense of lingering dread that hung over the bar, as though the very walls were soaked in the violence that had taken place there. James's heart pounded in his chest as he read on. The authorities had declared the bar a crime scene, closing it down indefinitely. But rumors persisted. Rumors that the spirits of those who had died in the brawl never left. They were said to be trapped, caught in a never-ending cycle of violence, reliving their final moments over and over again. The bar remained abandoned for years, a place of darkness and fear, until one day it simply vanished from the public consciousness. It was as if the building itself had decided to retreat from the world, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon it. James leaned back in his chair, the implications of what he had just read sinking in. The spirits he had encountered weren't just angry. They were trapped, bound to the place where they had died in such horrific circumstances. Their rage was their prison, and anyone who entered that bar was at risk of being pulled into their endless cycle of violence. But why had the bar appeared to him? Was it mere chance, or was there something more sinister at play? James's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. He needed to know more, needed to understand why the spirits were so powerful, and more importantly, how to break the cycle. He returned to the article, scanning it for any mention of how the spirits might be freed, but there was nothing. The article ended with a brief note about the bar's eventual demolition, the building supposedly torn down to make way for new construction. But James knew that wasn't true. He had seen the bar with his own eyes, walked through its cursed door. The bar still existed, hidden away from the world, waiting for its next victim. But then, a small detail caught his eye. An offhand mention of a relic found beneath the bar during the investigation. The article didn't go into detail, only noting that the relic had been removed by the authorities and placed in storage as evidence. The relic was never mentioned again, its significance lost in the chaos of the investigation. A relic. James's mind latched onto the word, a glimmer of hope sparking in the darkness. Could this relic be the key to breaking the spirit's hold on the bar? He had to find out. But where would he even begin to look? He searched through archives and historical records for any mention of the relic, but the trail was cold, the information sparse. Frustration gnawed at him as he spent hours poring over old documents, finding only vague references and dead ends. But finally he stumbled upon a mention of the relic in a forgotten police report, filed away in a dusty corner of the city's digital archives. The report described the relic as a small, intricately carved piece of wood, believed to be part of a ceremonial object, though its exact purpose was unknown. But one line stood out to James, sending a chill down his spine. The relic was found buried beneath the floorboards in the center of the bar, directly beneath where the bodies were discovered. The significance of the location wasn't lost on him. The relic had been at the epicenter of the violence, perhaps absorbing the rage and pain of the men who had died there. Could it be that the spirits were bound to the bar through this relic, their souls trapped by the very object that had witnessed their deaths? James knew he had to find the relic, to destroy it if necessary. It was the only way to free the spirits and to ensure that the bar could no longer ensnare the living. But the report offered no clue as to where the relic might be now. It had been taken by the authorities, but where it had ended up after that was a mystery. He spent the rest of the night digging through records, following a paper trail that led from the police evidence locker to a series of private collections, each more obscure than the last. The relic had changed hands several times over the decades, its significance forgotten by all but a few. But finally, he found what he was looking for, a mention of the relic in the inventory of a small, private museum on the outskirts of town, a place dedicated to the strange and the macabre. The museum's website was outdated, its photos grainy and poorly lit, but there, listed among the artifacts, was the relic, described as a wooden talisman of unknown origin, said to be cursed. James's heart raced as he jotted down the museum's address, his mind whirling with the possibilities. He had to see the relic for himself, had to find a way to break the curse and free the spirits. But the thought of returning to the bar, of facing those tormented souls again, filled him with dread. He knew that if he failed, the spirit's anger would consume him, just as it had nearly consumed him tonight. But he had no choice. If he didn't act, the bar would continue to trap others, drawing them into its nightmare. And he couldn't live with that knowledge. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, James made his decision. He would go to the museum, find the relic, and end the curse. It was the only way to put the spirits to rest and to save himself from becoming one of them. The small museum on the outskirts of town was a relic in its own right, a crumbling building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. James stood outside its wrought iron gates, the early morning fog curling around him like tendrils of some malevolent force. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the windows of the museum were dark, as though the building itself was trying to hide from the light of day. He hesitated at the gate, his hand resting on the cold metal. But there was no turning back now. The events of the previous night had left him with no choice. He had to find the relic and put an end to the curse that had claimed so many lives. He pushed the gate open with a creak that echoed through the fog-shrouded street and stepped onto the gravel path leading to the museum's entrance. The door was unlocked, a small bell chiming softly as he entered. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The museum was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and cramped rooms filled with forgotten artifacts that seemed to whisper of dark histories and untold secrets. James moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet, his eyes scanning the dimly lit displays for any sign of the relic. The museum was empty, silent except for the occasional creak of the building settling. It felt as though the place hadn't seen a visitor in years, its collection of strange and macabre objects left to gather dust. But James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows were hiding more than just inanimate relics. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering through the maze of exhibits, he found it. The relic sat in a small glass case at the far end of a dimly lit room, isolated from the other artifacts, as though even the museum curators had been wary of it. The wooden talisman was small, no larger than a hand, its surface intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change under the flickering light. James approached the case slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around the relic felt colder, heavier, as though the object itself was exuding a palpable aura of malevolence. He could feel its power, the weight of the countless lives it had touched, and the rage that had been absorbed into its very essence. He reached out to the glass, his fingers hovering just above its surface, and for a moment he hesitated. The stories he had read, the horrors he had witnessed, they all pointed to this relic as the source of the curse. But destroying it, breaking the cycle, would not be easy. It was clear that this was no ordinary object. It was a conduit, a link between the world of the living and the dead, and whatever power resided within it would not go quietly. But James couldn't allow himself to falter. He had come too far, and too much was at stake. With a deep breath, he pulled his hand back and searched the room for something he could use to break the glass. His eyes fell on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, its bright red color standing out against the muted tones of the room. He grabbed the extinguisher, its weight reassuring in his hands, and returned to the display case. With one last glance at the relic, he swung the extinguisher with all his strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying in all directions. The sound seemed to echo unnaturally, reverberating through the room as though the very walls were protesting his actions. As the dust settled, James reached into the case, his fingers closing around the cold, rough surface of the relic. The moment he touched it, a shock of energy coursed through him, as if the talisman itself were alive and aware of his intentions. His vision blurred, and for a moment he was overwhelmed by a flood of images, flashes of the brawl, of blood and death, of the spirits screaming in anguish as they were torn from their bodies. He staggered back, clutching the relic in his hands, fighting to stay grounded in the present. The museum around him seemed to warp and twist, the shadows lengthening, closing in on him as the spirit's rage surged through the relic, filling the room with a cold, oppressive energy. And then, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. James's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, the small screen casting a faint, ghostly light that barely penetrated the gloom. But it was enough to reveal what was happening. The shadows around him were moving, coalescing into forms that were all too familiar. The spirits from the bar had followed him. Their shapes emerged from the darkness, their faces twisted with anger and pain, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They surrounded him, their movements jerky and disjointed, as though they were caught between worlds, trapped in the same endless loop of violence that had claimed their lives. James backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The spirits closed in, their voices rising in a chorus of whispers, each one more desperate, more filled with rage than the last. He could feel their anger, their desire to pull him into their nightmare, to make him one of them. In a panic, he raised the relic, clutching it like a talisman against the darkness. The spirits recoiled, their forms flickering, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to grow more desperate, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. They were trapped, bound to the relic, their rage and pain feeding into its power. And now that he had the relic, they wanted him to feel their torment, to share in their eternal suffering. James's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to break the curse. The relic was the key. He was sure of it. But destroying it here, in this dark, forgotten place, might not be enough. The spirit's power was too strong, their connection to the relic too deep. He needed to return to where it had all begun, to the place where the curse had first taken hold. He needed to go back to the bar. The thought filled him with dread, but there was no other choice. He couldn't destroy the relic here, in the museum's sterile, lifeless halls. The curse had to be broken at its source, at the place where the spirits had died, where their rage had been born. With a final glance at the spirits, now closing in with renewed intensity, James turned and ran, the relic clutched tightly in his hands. The shadows reached out for him, but he pushed through, his mind focused on one goal, ending the nightmare once and for all. He burst out of the museum, the cold morning air hitting him like a slap to the face. The fog had lifted, revealing the gray, lifeless streets of the town. But James didn't stop to take in his surroundings. He knew what he had to do, and there was no time to waste. As he hurried back through the streets, the weight of the relic seemed to grow heavier in his hands, as if it were resisting his every step. The spirit's whispers echoed in his mind, urging him to turn back, to abandon his quest. But he pressed on, his determination fueled by the knowledge that he was the only one who could end this. The streets seemed to blur as he ran, the buildings and streetlights fading into the background as his destination loomed ahead. The bar, that cursed place where it had all begun. The phantom bar stood exactly as he had left it, its neon sign flickering weakly in the pale light of dawn. The sight of it filled him with a mixture of fear and resolve. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open, stepping back into the darkened interior. The bar was as he remembered it, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and old smoke, the furniture covered in a layer of dust. But this time, the oppressive silence that had greeted him before was gone. Instead, the room buzzed with a low, thrumming energy, as if the spirits themselves were anticipating his return. James moved to the center of the room, directly above where the relic had been buried all those years ago. The spirits were here. He could feel them all around him, their presence growing stronger with each passing second. They wanted the relic, needed it, but they also wanted something more. They wanted release. He placed the relic on the floor and took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He didn't know exactly how to break the curse, but he knew it had to be done here, in this place, where the spirit's anger had first taken root. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small metal lighter, its surface worn from years of use. He flicked the lighter open, the small flame dancing in the gloom. The spirit's whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though they sensed what he was about to do. James hesitated for only a moment before lowering the flame to the relic. The moment the flame touched the wood, the room exploded with light. The relic ignited instantly, the flames consuming it with an unnatural speed. The heat was intense, searing, and James stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. The spirit's whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices that echoed through the bar, shaking the very walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the relic crackled and popped as it was consumed by the flames. But James didn't move. His eyes locked on the burning talisman, willing it to be destroyed, to release the spirits from their torment. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The flames died out, leaving nothing but a pile of ashes on the floor. The room was silent, the oppressive energy that had filled it moments before dissipating like smoke in the wind. The spirits were gone, their presence no longer lingering in the air. James fell to his knees, his heart pounding, his body shaking with the aftermath of the ordeal. It was over. The relic was destroyed, the curse broken. The spirits were finally at rest. But as he knelt there, in the center of that cursed place, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, that the bar itself was alive, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander through its doors. James sat in the middle of the bar, surrounded by the charred remnants of the relic. The silence that followed the spirit's screams was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body aching, but a sense of grim satisfaction settled over him. The spirits were gone, their curse broken, and the phantom bar was nothing more than a decaying shell, its power finally extinguished. But even as he tried to take solace in that thought, a nagging sense of unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. The bar was quiet. Too quiet. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but there was something unsettling about the silence that now filled the room. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a place at rest. It was the silence of something waiting, something unfinished. James forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. He needed to leave, to get out of this place before it could trap him again. But as he turned to the door, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the ticking of a clock. He froze, his heart skipping a beat as he scanned the room for the source of the noise. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and James's eyes were drawn to the bar itself. The bottles and glasses were still in place, untouched by the chaos of the night. But as he watched, one of the glasses began to tremble, the liquid inside rippling as though disturbed by an unseen force. Then, without warning, the glass exploded, shards flying in all directions. James shielded his face, but when he looked again, the bar had changed. The dim light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, and the air grew thick with a familiar, metallic scent. Blood. James's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The bar wasn't done with him. The curse wasn't broken. It had merely shifted, adapting to the destruction of the relic. The spirits might have been released, but the bar itself remained cursed, its malevolent energy still seeking to claim a life. And now, with the relic destroyed, it had set its sights on him. The walls began to close in, the room darkening as the shadows lengthened, their shapes twisting into grotesque figures. The bar groaned under the weight of an invisible force, the wooden beams creaking ominously. The tapping noise returned, louder now, more frantic, echoing through the room like a heartbeat. James stumbled back, panic rising in his chest. He had to get out, had to escape before the bar could take him. But as he turned to the door, it slammed shut with a thunderous crash, the sound reverberating through the room. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive, as if the bar itself were alive, feeding on his fear. "No," James whispered, backing away from the door. "This can't be happening." But it was. The bar was closing in on him, its dark energy wrapping around him like a shroud. He could feel the malevolence in the air, the same anger and pain that had fueled the spirits, now directed solely at him. The bar was no longer just a building. It was a living entity, a predator, and he was its prey. Desperate, James looked around for a way out, but the windows were boarded up, the only exit blocked by the door that refused to budge. The bar's energy was suffocating, crushing him under its weight, and he could feel his strength waning, his will to fight slipping away. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light. James's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man from the night before, the leader of the brawl, the spirit who had almost claimed him. But this time, the man's face was different. There was no rage, no anger, only a deep, mournful sorrow. The spirit looked at James with hollow eyes, his expression one of resignation. He raised a hand, pointing to something behind the bar, and James's gaze followed. There, nestled among the bottles, was an old dust-covered ledger, its pages yellowed with age. James hesitated, but the spirit's gaze was insistent, urging him to look. With trembling hands, he reached for the ledger, pulling it free from its resting place. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather peeling away, but the moment he touched it, he felt a surge of energy, different from the malevolence that filled the bar. This was something older, deeper, a remnant of the past that had been hidden away, forgotten. He opened the ledger, the pages crackling under his fingers, and began to read. The handwriting was faded, the ink barely legible, but he could make out the names, dozens of them, each one followed by a date and a single word: paid. As he flipped through the pages, the truth began to dawn on him. This wasn't just a ledger. It was a record of debts, of lives claimed by the bar over the years. Each name represented a soul that had been trapped, just like the spirits of the brawl, their debts paid with their lives. The bar had been feeding on them, growing stronger with each soul it claimed, and now, with the relic gone, it was seeking a new victim. But there, at the very end of the ledger, he found something that made his blood run cold. His own name, written in the same faded ink, followed by today's date. And beneath it, a single word: pending. James's heart pounded in his chest as the full realization hit him. The bar had marked him, claimed him as its own. The relic had been only part of the curse. Destroying it hadn't freed the spirits. It had merely set them loose, leaving the bar's hunger unsatisfied. Now, it wanted him to take their place, to pay the debt that had been written in the ledger. He looked up at the spirit, his eyes wide with fear. The man's sorrowful expression hadn't changed, but there was something else in his gaze, an understanding, a shared recognition of their fates. The spirit had been bound to the bar by his own anger and pain, but now that he was free, he was offering James a choice. The ledger was the key. It held the names of all the souls the bar had claimed, their debts marked as paid. But there was one name that had yet to be crossed out, James's own. The bar was waiting for him to accept his fate, to submit to the curse and allow it to claim his life. But James wasn't ready to give in. He refused to let the bar take him, to become just another name in a ledger of the dead. He could feel the bar's energy growing stronger, its presence pressing down on him. But he knew there had to be a way out, a way to end this once and for all. In a desperate bid, he grabbed a pen from the bar and turned back to the ledger. The ink was nearly dry, the pen barely functional, but it was all he had. With a trembling hand, he struck a line through his name, marking it as paid. The moment he did, the room seemed to shift, the oppressive energy receding just slightly. But the bar wasn't done. The walls trembled, the shadows writhing as if in pain, and the air grew colder, more dangerous. James knew that crossing out his name wasn't enough. It was just a temporary reprieve. The bar wanted a life, a soul to claim, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. His mind raced, searching for a solution. He couldn't fight the bar directly. It was too powerful, too deeply rooted in the darkness. But perhaps there was another way, a way to satisfy the bar's hunger without sacrificing himself. His eyes fell on the shattered glass on the floor, the remnants of the relic that had once held the spirits captive. The bar had been feeding on anger, on pain and suffering, but it had also been tied to the spirits, bound by their rage. Now that they were gone, the bar's power was unfocused, wild, and James knew he had to find a way to contain it, to trap it once more. In a flash of inspiration, he realized what he had to do. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a contract, a binding agreement between the bar and its victims. By crossing out his name, he had altered the terms of that contract, if only temporarily. But if he could find a way to nullify the contract entirely, to break the bar's hold over its victims, he might be able to end the curse for good. He searched the bar frantically, looking for something, anything, that could serve as a focus, a new vessel to contain the bar's power. His eyes landed on a dusty old bottle of whiskey, long forgotten on the top shelf. It was a simple object, unremarkable in every way, but it was perfect, small enough to hold, empty enough to fill with the darkness that now threatened to consume him. He grabbed the bottle and the ledger, placing them on the bar. With shaking hands, he tore out the final page of the ledger, the page with his name on it, and stuffed it into the bottle. He could feel the bar's anger growing, the walls closing in. But he had to act quickly. He held the bottle in one hand and with the other, placed the relic's charred remains inside, the ashes swirling in the air before settling at the bottom. As he did, the bar seemed to roar in protest, the shadows growing thicker, more violent. But James didn't stop. He grabbed the pen and scrawled a final word on the bottle's label, the letters jagged and barely legible. Sealed. The moment the ink dried, the bottle began to glow, a faint, eerie light emanating from within. The room around him shuddered, the walls groaning as the bar's energy was drawn into the bottle, the shadows retreating, swirling around him like a storm before being sucked into the vessel. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of rage and despair, but James held on, his knuckles white as he gripped the bottle with all his strength. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm ceased. The bar fell silent, the air still, the shadows gone. The bottle in James's hand felt warm, vibrating with a faint hum, but the malevolent energy that had filled the room was gone. The bar was empty, lifeless, its curse sealed away within the bottle. James collapsed onto the bar, his strength finally giving out. He had done it. The curse was broken, the bar's power contained. He was free. But as he lay there, the bottle clutched in his hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The bar was quiet, yes, but it was also watching, waiting. He could feel its presence, a subtle, lingering awareness that hadn't been there before. He knew he couldn't stay. The bottle had sealed the curse, but the bar was still dangerous, still hungry. If he stayed too long, it might find a way to break free, to reclaim its power. He had to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. With a final weary glance around the room, James rose to his feet. The bottle was still warm in his hand, its contents shifting slightly as he moved. He walked to the door, his steps slow, deliberate, as though every movement took all the energy he had left. The door creaked open, the cool morning air a welcome relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the bar. He stepped outside, the bottle tucked under his arm, and didn't look back as he walked away. The bar faded into the mist, its neon sign flickering one last time before going dark. The phantom bar might have lost its grip on him, but he knew it wasn't gone forever. It was out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to find it, the next soul to walk through its doors. But for now, he had survived. And as the sun began to rise, casting its warm light over the city, James knew that this was only the beginning. The bar's curse had been sealed, but it hadn't been destroyed. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone to break the seal and unleash the darkness once more. But that was a battle for another day. For now, he was free, and that was enough.